how all these topics tie in together. Violence and liberals and feminism, the welfare state, using the state as the enforcer, whether it's through legislation, the battles we see between the left and the right, the liberals and the socialists and the Marxists versus the conservatives and the libertarians, whatever it may be. But even conservatives and libertarians still seem like small government, non-aggression principle. You don't get to dominate. Constitutionalism, the fundamentals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I get to do what I want, pursue what I want, self-determination, unless there's injury and harm, or injury in the sense of infringing on people's rights to do the same, or some sort of physical injury. And then obviously it gets complicated with contract law, and crime is just injury. But that's why we have, a jury of our peers to regulate conflict in the public and in the private. But that's what it comes down to, is public versus private again. How all these social justice claims tie into the big picture, especially which the fundamentals is using the state to regulate and enforce whatever your philosophy is. So if you're a philosophy that, I think, why it was reminding me of feminism and liberals, feminism, because the woman through legislation, had to or chose to see viability in using the state as the enforcer, the equalizer, sort of what guns did for whether smaller statured humans or more outnumbered clans or tribes or crews or gangs or families, right? So technology and weapons became the great equalizer in war and violence and enforcement and regulation in society, and the state became the enforcer and the regulator for, especially for women, but for so-called civility in the civilized new world, the industrial world, but also for what we would call pacifists, and which are generalized, and in today's culture, some of the things we're talking about with left versus right and liberals versus so-called conservatives. Not really so-called conservatives, just, the danger of generalizing so many people to a term that in itself has a lot of complexities and really shouldn't be made so black and white. But a lot of the, forefront issues, free speech, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, things like that, are, what are tied up in today's bifurcation of society, and aggression and conflict and finger pointing. And so, as somebody who didn't grow up or consider myself even in the adult years as so much a left-righter in the demographics of the two-party system, and feeling like a lot of my true education has come through experience and age and maturity, and taking time to try to be more educated in the past and in the present. But somebody that I don't think generalized gets put into the category of either a conservative or a liberal. I think stereotypically, my demographic being brown, I'd be put in with the liberals, And philosophically, I think most of my life, especially the younger I was, they say the older you get, a lot of people, the more conservative they get, which is true for myself. And in my younger years, my more idealized and somewhat naive previous self was far more liberal and at times socialist, Marxist, That's why I joke and say I'm a recovering socialist myself and a recovering Marxist myself. And, psychologically, some of it makes sense because the youth are a little more naive and a little more prone to idealism and lack of experience and knowledge of self. So it's not even just to be demonized because there's a commonality to it. It seems natural for those stages of life, into adolescence and into young adulthood to adulthood and seniority. So not just about demonizing that which might not hold what we view as the greatest perspective or knowledge of self or knowledge of society. So my younger liberal self, even my draw and appeal toward, it's the difference between Malcolm X and MLK, my draw and appeal toward nonviolence, and of course with good sentiments when I moved toward nonviolence and really believing that was possible, and not to minimize that that's still what I work for, and put all of your wisdom and your experience and consciousness into minimizing pain and violence and oppression and retaliation and all that stuff. But being realistic to the world we're living in and the history and the tendency of power to corrupt and people to self-preserve and use domination as one of the tools to get there, which is complex in life, which is why things like violence and domination and things that nowadays get generalized and simplified into toxic masculinity, these huge topics which we have not figured out as humans, and get back to tendencies and domination and power, because the equalizers are things like guns and the government and the state and force. Who has force to back up their will and their laws? And so where feminists may have viewed the patriarch as the male physical stature being bigger and dominating, and therefore needing protections and equalization and protection and opportunity and all the things that I think feminism at the beginning stood for: equal opportunity, try to get an equal playing field. But looking at the history of then that getting one, because having a history of the potential and experience of being dominated by a bigger being, the male, to power of numbers and legislation and the history and suffrage and everything that led up to the women's movement and civilization and society's tendency toward trying to be civilized, trying to be good, and have laws and constitutions and things that protect the rights of human beings, in a barbaristic history of what the majority was domination and survival of the fittest and genetic biological tendencies and instincts to preservation and survival and propagation of the seed in the family and the clan and the team, the side that you were on, that collected for the commonality of having each other's best interests and longevity at heart, which is a good thing. And so we minimize the difficulty of doing that and the tendency and the commonality of discordance and tension and conflict and the differing viewpoints and ideals and paths laid forward through philosophies of how to get there and who deserves what and what earns what. The strongest sometimes earns the fruits of the war. If two people see a pineapple and they want to get it for their people, may the best man win in history is how that took place. And even in today's politics, we can still see that in this warring, two-sided, bifurcated, two-party system for the most part, especially in the Trump versus the Biden and the right Republicans versus the Democrats, and the fire and venom that they are battling, allegedly in the most civil way through democracy, referring to this as the democracy as opposed to a representative of the people, a republic. But you can see that warring, and people whichever side wants to win wants to use the state as the enforcer of their will. So the Democrats want their people in. Let's say it's a 51-49 split, right? The whole problem and conflict with it being a peaceful system, if it's truly is a democracy, rule of the majority, as opposed to a true republic, rule of 2/3 vote, which still can never tread on the rights of the sovereign individuals, the people. Two very different systems. But right now, the overwhelming majority, their philosophy is that of using the system as the enforcer, which involves violence, because the police, the courts, the sheriffs, the bailiffs, all these people that enforce the law, the will of the people, whether it's left or right, is done through the rule of the fist and the gun. And so the hypocrisy and the oddity that I see is far more with so-called liberals and pacifists, my younger self, the idealists, the ones that believe that we have the right to a utopia and peace and safety and prosperity and well-being, that somehow is a right, as opposed to something that takes intelligence and cooperation and consistency and humility and trial and error and good heart and strong work ethic to accomplish. The entitlement of the generation and the people in the media right now, the programming right now, is to push people to feel entitled toward their will, and then the right to dominate other people to enforce it. The ideological problem is that a lot of the people on the left, the so-called pacifists, there's a disconnect from their belief and understanding that that's what they're really doing, is using power, force, and domination over other people. Because I think philosophically they believe that they're the more progressive. That's why progressive is kind of a degrading term, because it's sort of pompous, it's sort of belittling, as though we're progressive and you're left behind in your outdated, goofy ass beliefs and philosophies and politics, as if that's any way to start dialectical conversations, to reach a meeting of the minds as opposed to a domination from the ego. And so this disconnect from force and violence, which is still being used, which is, when I speak about the feminists, that's what's projected upon the dominating and beast-like male that needs to be civilized. That's the narrative, which obviously I disagree with and think comes from years and years of, not a meeting of the minds for sure, but some intentional propaganda as well, and good intent. Sometimes when a pendulum swings, it swings a little too far the other way. And so some of it is just a natural tendency for that to occur. But when understanding violence, I just think it's a good conversation. I think people need to put more thought and understanding, and firsthand experience is very different than theorizing and philosophizing about something that you don't have any direct information about. So to understand domination while never having been punched in the face can pose issues because you might not really have an understanding of what kind of force is necessary. To have a conversation in modern society about police brutality and to never have needed to subdue an aggressor or even be in that position where violence is taking place and a battle of the wills is taking place, and not only fists and physical violence is being used, but firearms and weapons and machines of imminent danger and extreme power are in the vicinity. And so you got people commenting and really weighing hard in on things that they truly have no knowledge of self and knowledge of the true whatever it is you're looking at, the meat and the pieces and all the criteria that make up these things that we're all speaking so adamantly and certainly about nowadays in society. And so it's just a very important thing within especially a republic, and what I believe the foundation of America was working toward and trying to establish and outlining in laws and constitutions and restrictions and declarations, which was to work toward a society where people have self-determination and we minimize the violence and the domination by agreeing that self-determination is a good thing in a true free market capitalist society. Meaning that you have the right to get some resources and make some things, create some music, make some jewelry, whatever it is, build houses, be an engineer, create batteries, and then interact with other humans for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for prosperity. Not with a big government getting in the way and regulating that commerce. And so the public and the private comes back to the public, the private, and how you're going to enforce that. Enforcement comes from force. And so we live in a society where, we're so detached from the enforcement. If you're irritated at your neighbors and you call the police, you don't have to deal with it face to face. You don't have to go dominate. And so you don't see or experience what it takes to regulate that. And you're using a third party who, you're believing has your best interest, their best interest, is enacting what we do in a true court of law of the people if there is controversy in the public. That these officers are able and capable in doing that fairly and consistently on the spot. It's a tough job. It's not something to belittle because most of us have terrible conflict resolution. So, just wanted to bring the topic up. My mind was focused on it, and I think we need to spend more time realistically understanding and having good teachers and good communicators and people that are talented and truly relaying and relating what enforcement is, what domination is. When you use the state, when you do it yourself, why we have the right to bear arms. Because that protection, even those who want guns out of the people, want to get rid of the Second Amendment, still want a way to enforce that. They want the government to have guns. They still believe in an enforcer. And so their philosophy is that those in that position are equipped to do it and are going to be fair, and that is what will minimize crime. Which is why I believe even those people, the left-right paradigm, in their head they believe good things. We just differ in philosophies about what is the means to the end. How we're going to get there, and then have it and keep it consistently and build on that to bigger and better and greater, grandest visions of who we are and what we believe society should be. But the enforcement of that comes from force, and so people should have a more direct experience of what that force entails and how they're using it and in what ways. And so these family courts, when people are using the judges and the governments to dominate and regulate and exchange currency and money and resources and value, all these things that get back to what we claim was the role of the government, the role of the enforcers, the role of the sheriff, the role of ourselves as individuals, as sovereigns, and how we make that happen. Because force doesn't always make everything happen, which is why intellect, intelligence, humility, and wisdom are all equal crucial parts, far more necessary and valuable parts than the force and the enforcer. Because the force and the enforcer so many times reverts back to war. Psychological, verbal, emotional, and physical. And we all believe that we're more civilized than we really are. Because it's a barbaristic world. And if people were truly empowered, like some X-Men with some power to enforce their will, I think we'd see more warring than we'd like to believe. Because we haven't been trained and conditioned and internalized the value and the reason and the know-how of how to get there to be good, productive communicators and problem solvers. So as we stumble, we get fearful, then we get angry. Then we lash out. So we got a lot of work to do. Character development always comes back to the same things. If you for peace, love, and prosperity. And so, peace to my people. Have some humility when you're talking about all these things that need to be enforced by force. Because people are getting fiery. This nation is getting fiery. And while people are flapping their lips, most of them have never been punched in the face. Most of them have never seen war. As they idealize love and utopia. It's beautiful to idealize that, to see it, to try to hold it as a vision. But it's more important to have wisdom and knowledge of self, to know how to actually implement that. And it starts with family and self. If your family's not in touch like that, like you can't talk politics and religion and sex and drugs and rock and roll with your own family without it being tense and shameful or, all the things that we see reflected in the macro that are really in the micro, in our own families, our own relationships, with our children, our beloveds, our parents. Most of our houses are in discordance. Most of our blocks aren't anywhere on the same page. Lots of people don't even talk to their neighbors, and they're pointing fingers at people over the internet, having arguments with people they've never even seen, that they don't even have to look at face to face and feel the heartbeat. Or the adrenaline if things get tough. Or the equalizers. If somebody you flapping your lips at might get offended enough to punch you in the face. So these equalizers are good. They're part of what pushed us to civility. Because most times it sucks to get punched in the face. And so what stops a lot of people, especially in the world of men, from flapping their lips at other men and other people, is because a lot of people have been punched in the face and they realize I can take it too far. And so there's incentive to speak better, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to de-escalate, to have nonviolent communication and I statements and active listening and all the things that we could probably learn to implement and teach our children as we give them those first 3 years of nurturing and conditioning and raising the babies at first into love and security, so that they're not even raising into teens and young adults as defensive, damaged, and traumatized humans, spending most of their lives trying to heal the demons, pointing at the other world about how faulty they are. So, it's the kind of things I think about. How we gonna get on the same page, how we get on the same path, without dominating people to do it. My way's the right way, and I'm gonna force you to see how it is. It's hard. So that's what we gotta work at. If I see you on the social medias, you causing more conflict and discomfort than you are inspiration and meeting of the minds, then you and I got things to work on. And we should start with self. So I'm gonna start with self. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, if I'm confusing, if I have clarity, and let's keep it solution oriented. Freedom is the movement. Peace, love, and positivity. Rhymesforthetimes.com. We got the music for the soundtrack of the world. Peace and love. It's all coming together right here now. It's all coming together right here now. It's all coming together right here. Who's that? It's love. Can you feel it coming through that conscious revolutionary music?